Thank you, everyone. As you know, Caroline Gale is at the New York premiere and unable to attend our screening tonight. But she has asked me to introduce the film briefly, since the history of its production is rather complex, and we thought you might find it of interest. The initial footage was shot by Caroline's late partner, Elizabeth Bansha, whose professional name was Liz Banshee, and it was under that name that she directed the small number of feature films that constitute her output. Born in Boston in 1952, Liz became one of a very small number of independent American woman filmmakers of the time. Her first professionally released production was The Forests and the Fields in 1975, soon after her graduation from NYU's Tisch School of the Arts. Shot on 16 millimeter in rural Massachusetts, but set in Galway, Ireland in 1691, with period costumes and props borrowed from Tisch, The Forests and the Fields tells the story of a doomed group of General Ginkel's cavalry hunting down stray Jacobite soldiers. They encounter evil spirits and other folkloric fiends, all realized with inventive and gruesome practical effects, mostly handcrafted by Liz Banshee herself. As it was filmed by an Irish-American director at the height of the Troubles, the film was interpreted as, and was intended to be, a political allegory in a similar vein as Night of the Living Dead and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I encourage you all to seek it out. Despite its low production values, it still has a large cult following. And perhaps to pair it in a double feature with Ben Wheatley's 2013 film, A Field in England, on which it is clearly an influence. Forests was well received in both America and Europe, and it was on the strength of this that Liz secured funding for her second feature, Willow on the Water. It was at this point that, as she would put it, the fuckery began. Her investors objected to her subject matter, a loose adaptation of Algernon Blackwood's story The Willows, to be filmed on location on a small island in Nantucket Sound. They would have preferred another Irish story, and one with a more explicit supernatural element, like the terrifying wood sprites and devil flowers she had created for her first film. The end result was satisfying to no one. She walked out on the project halfway through, and though her name still appears as director on the finished product, much of it was in fact filmed by the cinematographer, who, in one of those unpredictable misalignments of personal and professional priorities, would fall in love with her during the process. I was working on these awful B movies for 3 years, Caroline Gale told me. Everyone was looking for the next Wes Craven, but the production company was like this professional shit-making machine. Good ideas went in at one end, but once it passed through the shit filter, it was untouchable. Liz was the first person I'd met in that industry with any integrity. Liz and Caroline would work together on 3 more films, as well as a short segment for Italian television as part of a Dario Argento-produced anthology, but she never recaptured the same level of attention she had received from Forests. I first started to correspond with Liz around 1990 in the course of some dovetailing genealogical research. Elizabeth's last name, Bansha, is the name of the village in County Tipperary from which her ancestors and mine both come. But I didn't meet her in person until 1992 while she was visiting Ireland and I was spending my undergraduate junior year at University College Dublin. We met up for a few drinks that fall, and eventually we spent a weekend up in Sligo to scout locations. She had brought along a Super 8 camera, and to visit the grave of W.B. Yeats. In person, I found her friendly, but a little distant and not easy to relate to. She was a professional woman of twice my age, with a chronic smoker's cough, and the only things we really found to talk about were the stories of Robert Aikman, the new Ministry album, and beer. We stayed at a B&B and caught the morning train back to Dublin. She was enthusiastic, having put in a productive weekend's work, and as we smoked Dunhills, she told me a little about her projected film. It would begin as a sort of rural noir, she told me, centering around a reluctant recruit to the IRA's dairy brigade, but would take a monstrous turn partway through. Its main leitmotifs would be the various mounds or tumuli that dotted the Irish landscape, detailed in an unnatural, oversaturated green. It would be filmed on multiple film stocks and from multiple points of view. And what she described to me sounded like an ambitious horror version of Rashomon. It would be her most personal film so far and would even share her name, Banshee. She had turned to look out the window. It was a sunny morning and most of the trees still had their leaves. I heard something like a sneeze, and then her window was covered in a flat burst of phlegmy red and black streaks. She turned to look at me, face blotched and blank, and collapsed on my shoulder. She heaved and vomited blood down the front of me. Within minutes, she was dead. At a hospital near Mullingar, they gave me nurses' scrubs to change into. I called Caroline in Boston. I had never spoken to her before. Between us, we made arrangements to ship Liz home. Turns out it was lung cancer. They had both known about it, but hadn't realized it was so advanced. I didn't have the money to fly to America for the funeral, and I've always regretted that. That was 20-some years ago. Since that time, Caroline has been determined to finish the film. Liz had filmed several hours of raw footage for Banshee, mostly in New England, and a dozen scenes were essentially complete, but there were countless problems. There was no money. There was no real script, only notes. Before long, the actors she had shot had aged out of their roles or had given up acting altogether. In the late 90s, Caroline began again in earnest, shooting new footage on 35mm and digital video. She wrote a script treatment, which I expanded into a full draft 3 or 4 times. I have viewed the existing footage over and over, but it was only last year that I noticed something odd. In the Sligo 8mm, in addition to shots of the coastline and the countryside, Liz had panned once around the interior of her room at our bed and breakfast. She had probably found it, as I had, charming and worthy of a little documentation. In the camera's brief traversal, it had passed across the edge of a mirror that hung above the 18th century armoire, and briefly visible in this mirror is a pale white face, which for years I assumed was Liz's own. But it finally became clear to me that the angle was all wrong, and in any case, no camera was visible there. The face on closer inspection has an eager look about it, but it is not detectably male or female, and I did not recognize it. We had met up with no one on that trip to speak of, certainly no one who would have returned with Liz to her room. Liz was using film with a magnetic soundtrack, but this footage is silent, although on the rest of the roll, ambient noise, the wind and the ocean, is clearly heard. This footage is incorporated about 20 minutes into the film you are about to see. For some time after this, I imagined that I could see that face fleetingly in other parts of the film as it came together. In Liz's footage from the early 90s and in Caroline's from 99 and 2015, but this was a product of overwork only. I was putting myself in the position of our film's hero, whose paranoia leads him to believe that everyone he meets is a British spy. Still, it was disconcerting to feel that the film was watching us as we created it. In the end, it all came together. The final product is admittedly an assemblage, filmed in 8mm, 35mm, and DV over the course of 2.5 decades, credited to 4 screenwriters and performed by 2 or 3 mostly independent casts. Although Liz had intended it to be an expression of her own soul's inner landscapes, that has proved impossible. This is something else, our own gift of admiration and horror and fear, passed more than once through the death filter, but I still have every hope that you will find it memorable. At the cast and crew preview screening last week, I stood at the side of the theater and I made a point of watching the audience. And I really believe that they were all enraptured, proud of our work and how we had honored Liz's memory, stretching their necks toward the screen, rigid and unblinking, hardly flinching even at the worst frightening screams. A field of faces like colorless sunflowers forced to follow the light. I'm afraid we've run out of time for questions. I think we should roll the film. Thank you.